You're now live.
Okay, we are live and Senator Brock is arriving, so we're going to start because we are behind time. Committee, I gave you your break up front. I have a hard stop at 4:45. You can finish up without me, but I wanted to try and make up for the time that we had a little more time with Dr. Levine than I had anticipated. Today is Vermont Housing and Conservation Coalition Day at the State House, and I guess this is the State House. So we have Chris Donnelly from Champlain Housing Trust. Do you have a individual presentations or one that you're all?
I'm just going to do an introduction, Chris Donnelly of Champlain Housing Trust for the record. I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then pass it to Eric Farrell. And he's probably going to take the lion's share of your time since we have opportunity in your morning committees as well.
Okay, which, yeah.
To save you some time.
Great, okay. So the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Thank you. Again, Chris Donnelly with the Champlain Housing Trust, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Vermont Housing Conservation Coalition. I just want to do a quick overview. As you know, the property transfer tax is collected on the sale of real estate. By statute, roughly half of it is supposed to go to the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and each year, because of other pressures in the budget, it's not withstood. This year, the governor made a recommendation to use some one-time funds to help make up some of that difference. And the total recommendation from the governor is $34.8 million. That's 10.8 in property transfer tax, 4 million through the capital bill, and 20 million in one-time resources. So, and again, I know we will be, if we haven't been in your morning committees, we will be in there and we can go into a little bit more detail. I did want to share the screen just really briefly, and then I'll pass it to Eric Farrell. So this is just the image here is what Eric will speak to. This is a rendering of a development that's underway in Burlington. That's a dual mission project that we call, that has both conservation and housing connected to it. And on the bottom of this page, and I borrowed this from the Housing Conservation Board, has the statutory mission of that you have put into Vermont law. So I just want to point out that it's not just about housing and conservation, but it's also about supporting the economic vitality and quality of life in the state. And I will add that on the House side, there is a bill that's been introduced that encourages the board to change some of its eligible uses to include access to land and housing for the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And as we know, we have a long-standing history of local, state, and federal policies and practices that have been racist. And I think we need to work together to advance some of those systemic racist policies and address that inequity in our state. So we're looking forward to having that conversation. Our coalition hasn't really dived into the particulars of that bill, but we're looking forward to talking to all of you about that. So I'm going to stop.
Yeah, because we only have the commissioner for 15 minutes, so this is a hard stop at quarter of. Okay.
So I'm passing it over to Eric.
All right. Thank you for having us, and with your indulgence, I'll take 5 minutes to breeze through my remarks. I'm a slow reader because I'm Lebanese, but I've been a private developer in Burlington for over 50 years, nearly 50 years, hard to believe. I'm here to strongly urge you to support the governor's recommendation to increase VHCB's funding from 17 to 34, and here's why. Weaving market rate, mixed income, and affordable housing into a single development is financially challenging. For 25 years, I've turned to Champlain Housing Trust, Housing Vermont, and Cathedral Square for help. I'll briefly mention 3 examples. In 2011, we completed a 516-unit Odell Parkway neighborhood in South Burlington, an award-winning smart growth community. Odell cost $75 million to build. VHCB provided $5 million, so the leverage ratio, and it was private sources of 70 million. The ratio was 14-to-1 leverage. In 2013, we completed another project called Thayer Commons, 188-unit neighborhood in Burlington's New North End with affordable housing, senior housing, and market rate, located next to shopping, dining, services, and a large public park. Thayer cost $30 million. VHCB put up about 2, which leveraged 28 million of private sources. That ratio was 14-to-1, that leverage ratio. The economic impact of these 2 projects is even greater when you add in hundreds of construction and related jobs created, plus the indirect dollars for goods and services purchased in the local community. But I want to be very clear, but for VHCB fundings, neither of these 2 neighborhoods would have been built. Our current and most ambitious collaboration is Cambrian Rise in Burlington, on the site of former Burlington College, within walking distance of downtown services and Waterfront Park. Cambrian Rise represents a unique public-private partnership that addresses the city's critical need for affordable, mixed income, and market rate housing. It offers a new 12-acre park, including a sandy beach on Lake Champlain. It will be the most environmentally sustainable and economically diverse neighborhood in the city, if not the entire state. Our commitment to sustainability takes the form of energy efficient site and building design, stormwater management, lake protection, alternate modes of transportation, all blended into the natural environment. We began with the restoration of the former St. Joseph's Orphanage into 65 residential units that opened in July of 17. CHT opened Laurentide in October of 19, offering 76 units of affordable rental family housing. In July 2020, after a short delay due to COVID, we opened 90 units of market rate rental housing along with neighborhood commercial uses. Cathedral Square will open Juniper House in March of this year, offering 70 units of affordable rental senior housing. In early this summer, we expect to break ground on another 125 units of market rate rental housing scheduled to open mid next year. Later this year, after some fits and starts, we hope to finally break ground on our first for sale building, offering both market rate and affordable condominiums ready for occupancy in the spring of 23, 2 years out. The mayor and the city council recently approved an increase in the allowable density at Cambrian Rise from 770 to 950 housing units, representing a significant increase in critically needed housing and the creation of several hundred construction and permanent jobs. So I'll say it again, but for VHCB's support, Cambrian Rise would never have been feasible. To date, VHCB has invested nearly $4.5 million in affordable housing and public parkland at Cambrian Rise. By mid-22, VHCB's funding will have leveraged over $60 million in private equity and funding, representing a ratio of 14-to-1. When Cambrian Rise is complete, I dare say that VHCB's funding will have leveraged over $200 million in private equity and financing for a ratio that's simply off the charts. In my 2017 testimony, I offered my perspective as a developer and as a Vermont taxpayer. I would like to offer you the same perspective today. As a real estate developer, I pay my fair share of transfer taxes. And while I will never say that I am thrilled by the opportunity to pay any taxes, I'm gratified in knowing that the transfer tax is used to support VHCB's incredible work. Vermont taxpayers get a huge leverage from VHCB's judicial use of funds, and that makes it a very good deal and satisfying for me as an individual taxpayer. VHCB needs to continue its work of stimulating affordable and workforce housing. VHCB needs to continue its work of protecting the environment. And VHCB needs to continue its work of stimulating economic development and housing-related construction employment. That is a powerful engine for that cause. So I asked you to fully fund the governor's recommendation for VHCB funding next year because it's a very good deal for Vermonters. Thank you.
Okay,
5 minutes. I was
5 minutes. You're doing well. Okay, Abby, are you going to tell us not to fund it?
No, I'm gonna tell you exactly what he told you. And also leave a little bit of time if there's questions, Madam Chair. But
That would be great.
I'm here to represent the conservation side of the coalition. And so if there's any questions around conservation that come up, I'm here to help. But in the 3 minutes we've got, perhaps we'll see if there's questions.
Have we got questions? Okay, Senator Bray.
Yes, please. So congratulations on the projects, and I'll jump right to it. What energy code are the projects that VHCB and others support? Do you go to the stretch code, the straight normal energy code? What's the standard used?
you're asking me that question?
Sure, Mr. Farrell, you probably
Well, I
know that
would
one
say this.
firsthand.
I'm not technically competent about the specific codes, but I will say that we have always maximized and qualified for every energy upgrade incentive that's on the books. And that's for every building we've built in the last 15 or 20 years. So we go well beyond the minimum code because we just think it's a good long-term investment in the buildings that we build.
And I'll just add that I don't recall the exact numbers, but when we did the blower door test at that 76 unit building, it did better than I think a passive house. So it is very highly insulated and tight. So we get all the investments from Vermont Gas and BEIC or the local BED when we do these.
Great. Well, thanks very much. We're dealing with weatherization, and it's certainly a lot easier, more cost effective to build it in at the outset than try to get there after and upgrade.
2 minutes, so one quick question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the question I have is the governor's budget increases funding for VHCB by 34 million. Does it also, and that is one-time funding, I think, does it also get rid of the notwithstanding language that is in there, or is that still included? I see Chris shaking his head.
No, it's there's 20 million of one-time money included in that 34.8. So it's a 1 year bump.
A 1 year, $20 million bump, and then 14 million base. Is that correct?
The base last year was 17 million. There's actually a small cut in the capital bill as well, $2.5 million capital bill cut.
Okay,
So
but it doesn't change the notwithstanding on the transfer tax.
correct. Yeah, there's a base budget.
So Mr. Farrell doesn't get to feel good about paying that tax this year.
I feel great about paying taxes in Vermont. I wish
We're
more of my friends would stay as residents in this state. Pisses me off when they move. Excuse my language.
We're skimming off the top of that tax to pay off the $30 million bond that we put into housing maybe 4 years ago. So it's going for a good cause. Senator Bray, I don't have time for another question. Can you email it? Because I've only got Commissioner Tierney for 15 minutes right now.
Okay.
And if
I'll send it right to Mr. Dowling.
that would be great. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Housing People, for everything you do, Coalition. I don't think we have a whole lot of control over how the money gets allocated, but we'll put our voice in. Okay, I'm
Thank you.
gonna
Thank you.
move on. This is This is marathon time. Getting close to the end of the year. Commissioner and Barb Neal is here, and I think I saw Roger Marcoux. I just wanted to give some time for an update on the E911. We heard there was a deficit. It sounds like it's more of a systemic deficit, and trying to figure out what a solution to that might be. And, do we need to do some changes in the funds, or, what's going on? So, Commissioner, I've got you first, but I don't know if you've got anything, planned, but I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, June Tierney, Commissioner, Department of Public Service. I'm mindful that you have a very short window of time, so I want to be sure we use the time for your purposes, committee. I think the letter that Executive Director Neal sent yesterday lays the problem out pretty well. Where perhaps I would have said something different is we need to note that the administration has put forward a solution. I just am not in a position to speak to what the glide path is for that solution. The solution is the executive order that the governor put out that proposed a reorganization that would have brought the E911 organization under the Agency of Public Safety. And my understanding is from that executive order that there are cost efficiencies to be realized from doing that would address the budget issue that Director Neal has teed up in her letter very nicely. The facts around the fund itself, its revenues and expenditures haven't changed from when you were briefed by the JFO, I think, on this. And we can certainly come back and give you a detailed presentation about that as well. An observation I would make is that when the Department of Public Service ran into a funding issue with the gross receipts tax a couple of years ago, we were asked to study the state of our market and the future trends of revenue and the like to come up with proposals for what to do about it. And similarly, this committee, I think last year, asked the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to study funding options for the PEG access groups. I'm not suggesting that a study is a good idea here. I'm just saying that both examples show how there's been fundamental change, not just in the market around telecommunications, but also the taxation and revenue generation assumptions that have been made for generations that have paid for E911 and for PEG and to some extent for my department. And so what you're seeing here with E911 is their version of that problem. We need to perhaps change how we think about it. And the administration's approach was to reorganize. And so that's the solution that's on the table from the administration's perspective. Anticipating that you would want to know more, I did make inquiry as to what exactly the analysis is underpinning the plan in the executive order. I've not been able to get answers to that. And I think, frankly, if you want to delve into that more, you really ought to hear from Commissioner Gresham and Commissioner Sherling. I don't have a lot of visibility into Director Neal's operations, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me to do so. We manage the fund, and she very capably manages her operations. So that's what I've got for you today.
Okay, I think my concern is this committee has nothing to do with reorganizing. I'm assuming that's the Government Operations Committee. And did the House file an objection to that executive order? I thought they did. So that may or may not. I think all the objections were just, we need time to, work this through. May or may not proceed. I assume if we have a systemic deficit, it's only going to get worse as we go forward. And because this would just say, well, there'll be economies of scale. But that doesn't, the landscape and thus the taxation scape of telecommunications is changing. And we keep finding more and more things to fund. And so I think we need to deal with that, whether or not that's where E911 ends up in the end. My first concern, and I'll ask, I think, Roger, you may have been around at the beginning, but there's been a lot of questions about why E911 is out there on its own, kind of hanging out. But where's Senator McDonald when I need him? He's probably the only other one that's been around long enough to remember when E911, and it may even have been 911, was first proposed. There was significant feedback because Vermonters didn't want the government knowing where they were. And I have a feeling the fact that you were kind of removed from the government may have been a response to that. And I'm just wondering, has our attitude changed so much that are you still getting pushback from people who don't want you to know where they are? And might that get worse if you're in the same building with the state police? And am I right? Does anyone know in that recollection?
It was a bit before my time.
Geez, I am old. Okay.
Well, having said that, my department here started a county 911 system in 1975 or so.
Oh,
we had
no,
been doing
then
it
I'm
for
not
quite a-
that old. All right.
So in the very early 90s, the discussion started about this. But what I've learned is that there needed to be buy-in from all of the communities. And because we needed cooperation to be able to do the mapping, which touches on just about every household in the state. And so in the best way, it was felt, and again, this is just my understanding, but it was felt that the best way to exhibit the transparency was to have representatives from each first responder group, and then there were members of the public and the municipalities and everything like that. So that's kind of my understanding of why it ended up being it's a standalone board. So Barb, I don't know if I missed anything.
No, that's exactly my understanding as well.
Okay.
Um,
So if we don't get, you've got $1 million shortfall, right? And that's this past year.
That's what we're projecting at the end of FY21. Barbara Neal, Executive Director of the 911 Board, for the record.
Okay.
That includes a $672,000 shortfall in the appropriation we expected in FY20, the appropriation that was approved. We did not receive that $672,000, and then so far this year in our monthly, there's a
But
monthly.
you didn't get the $672,000 from whom?
I'm sorry, from the Vermont Universal Service Fund. We are.
Okay, so the Universal Service Fund is not producing what
Correct.
we need it to produce. Okay.
Yes. So far in this fiscal year, we're behind $404,000 of our $4.8 million appropriation. So those two things combined are having us project the $1 million shortfall by the end of this fiscal year.
Coming year, okay.
No, by the end of, on June 30th, 2021.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so, but it's not from the previous fiscal year.
We were able to, we have carry forward each year. And so we were able to manage our cash flow through that $672,000 shortfall in the last fiscal year. But the problem never went away. It just continued, you know, it just was, we were able to kick the can down the road a little bit before it really impacted our operations, which it is doing now.
Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Barb or Ms. Neal. I'm never sure how formal we're supposed to be on these calls, but for coming and just for the record, she and I had a really great conversation on Monday with lots of background information about all of this. So which was really helpful. I'm curious, did the E911 board make a request to the governor to include funding in the budget adjustment to deal with this issue? And if so, why didn't it get taken? Because it's a current fiscal year situation, isn't it?
Correct. So this problem is not new, and we became aware of the problem in November 2019, of the most immediate problem, when Commissioner Tierney and informed me, Commissioner Gresham, and others that the Universal Service Fund was not expected to meet its, to have enough revenue to support the FY20 appropriation to the 911 board. And if I recall correctly at the time, the projection was probably a $230,000 shortfall. In the end, it was a $670,000 shortfall. So finance and management was aware of it as far back as November 2019. And there have been ongoing conversations last fall, most recently, with Commissioner Gresham and also with the Secretary of Administration, so that they were aware of the problem. We followed our usual mechanisms, if you will, for getting that information to the administration. And I think the simplest way to say it is no solution has been identified. And so, you know, here we are.
Okay. And if I'm remembering correctly, the problem with the Universal Service Fund is as more and more telephone service basically goes to VoIP. No, we tax VoIP. It's going elsewhere. That we are losing our base, the base of our revenue source. And the question is, can we sweep that in? Because economies of scale only go so far. If your costs will continue to go up with inflation and salaries and all the rest of it. And if your funding source isn't keeping pace, it's just going to become a burden on others. So has anyone given any thought to adjustments that could be made to the service fund? No.
Madam Chair, I was very clear at the outset of my testimony that I think respectfully the administration disagrees with Director Neal. The administration has identified a solution,
Yes.
but I hear your comments that it's not a solution from your perspective if the executive order itself is not acceptable. And that's a part that I'm just not the person to be questioning about that. From a clinical perspective, meaning I am not speaking for the administration, I am simply pointing out as a matter of expertise. I think in 2019, the legislature approved an increase in the VUSF of 0.4%, which has successfully generated more revenue. However, that was also ring fenced expressly for the connectivity initiative and for last mile build out. So it's not for me to say that that money should be taken and put toward E911, but it is certainly something that's out there for the legislature to consider.
Okay, Senator Pearson, thank you.
Commissioner, even let's say I agreed with the executive order, the House has objected, so that's over. It's out of our hands now. So is there any thought of coming up with an alternative to get us out of this, or is the administration just as happy for us to try to come up with a solution?
Well, I really, really appreciate the question, Senator, and you'll forgive me. This is just not my area of expertise. My understanding is that respectfully, again, the legislature takes the position that the executive order is out of it. I don't believe the counsel to the governor shares that view. And it's just not for me to speak to the point.
Yeah.
But clinically speaking, as I said, I'm not speaking for the administration. I'm just giving you my best observations. You have the decision that was taken to ring fence that money. That would be an expedient, I suppose, but at the end of the day, there's a need to revisit the structural foundation for how this very important public service function is maintained. And whether it's by executive order or through deliberations and collaboration with the legislature, reorganization, as I understand it, accepting that I don't have deep understanding here, reorganization would be a means of streamlining and bringing the VUSF funding into the Agency of Public Safety, along with whatever resources they are able to bring to bear on funding this function. Obviously, again, clinically speaking, you have the option of raising a tax always. You'll forgive me, I can't tell you on behalf of the administration that that's something that Governor favors.
No, we understand that. But we did put a ring around a certain amount of money. And I think we can look at that amount, and then we can look at perhaps there's an offset coming from the federal government. We can do some value on that. So,
well, Madam Chair, again, I was listening to testimony from the Joint Fiscal Office, I think a couple of weeks ago in your committee, where the observation was made that the department has been slow to do this year's connectivity initiative RFR, request for proposals. And I think you should know that, I've been very mindful of the concerns that Director Neal has brought up. I've participated in those discussions. And so in addition to the work that we've been doing on COVID response that simply has set us behind in many of the things that we would otherwise do, I deemed it best to sort of hold off with that RFR because, I'm aware that this may be a resource that the legislature wants to turn to, at least in the short term. In the House, as you may be aware, they are also deliberating about whether to use those same monies to fund the Vermont Vermont Community Broadband Authority. So my judgment was it's best to stand still for a moment, let some of the smoke clear, and give people the option before.
Probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's money, and there's always a lot of ideas how to spend it. Senator Bray.
And on the executive order and the fate of that, I guess we'll find out on April 15th what the administration chooses to do in terms of its novel interpretation of existing statute that it's honored in the past. But I'm just trying to check in on timeliness at 60 days off. is there any issue here in terms of how bills are going to proceed, or a tax bill is going to be put together, or allocations, that we don't have 60 days to sort this out? I just want to make sure while the smoke is clearing, which seems like a good idea, are we under any kind of time constraint?
Senator, if you're asking me, I think you are. I really have to say we've reached the limit of my ability to answer questions about executive order protocol. I think it would probably be best to have counsel in to do that.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a lot I can do as a lawyer, but this is not my bailiwick.
And this committee has not been involved in that at all. I know Senator Bray has, but it is beyond our expertise. Okay, Senator Brock. Oh, you have one other. Okay, Senator Bray.
Really, it's that, do we need to sort this out in the next 60 days? Or if this hangs while the executive order, et cetera, gets sorted out, are we fine? Because there's still ample time. There's no downside. We're not going to lose service. We're not going to X, Y, or Z. I'm just trying to do that side
Understood.
of the question.
Understood. I think you may want to ask Director Neal about that. From my perspective, the feedback I'm getting from this committee, unless I hear otherwise, is that you welcome my staying my hand on the Connectivity Initiative RFP for this year, so that you have an option that I'm not advocating for, but that is there. I'm doing my best to be very candid with the committee within the constraints of my own authority, but perhaps Director Neal can speak better to the point, Senator Bray.
Okay. Director
I
Neal.
can, if I may, Senator Cummings.
Yes.
So there are some immediate impacts of the budget deficit that we are experiencing right now. One has to do with a vacancy that we've been carrying for over a year that has cut in half our capacity for training, quality control, public outreach, and education. But on a larger scale than just one vacancy, is there's an immediate risk to our ability to reimburse Vermont's public safety answering points. There are 6 of them for their call handling services in FY21. So of our $4.8 million budget, just over $1 million is for PSAP reimbursements. The Department of Public Safety typically gets, it varies from year to year, but it's about $730,000 in that PSAP reimbursement for the call handling services they provide at their 2 public safety answering points. The remainder of that fund is distributed among 4 regional PSAPs, and we have about 900,000 and a little bit left in that fund that has not yet been dispersed. If we were to not pay our public safety answering points, there are consequences to that, obviously, not the least of which is that they may choose not to participate in the 911 system moving forward, which would be, which is of great concern to me and the board chair as well. I'll speak for him on this. And Roger, maybe you want to add some more here.
Yeah. This is kind of a timeline of what's happened. We've gone to Commissioner Gresham, and he basically told us that folks that are receiving their budgets from special funding, he expects for them to manage within their budget, within their funding. So we talked to Secretary Young. We've had meetings with her, and she, it was basically a briefing, didn't offer any solutions, but told us that the administration was concerned about it. We've talked to Commissioner Shirley, and initially the conversation was about absorbing 911 into the agency. And and then we brought up that we were going to be, could be up to $1 million in the hole. And the only thing that he's mentioned, and Barb, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that it's easier to find $1 million in a $130 million budget than it is in a $4.5 million budget, which is ours, which quite frankly doesn't sound like a plan to me. I think the initial mission was to, just take care of getting the executive order of creating the agency. So that's one question I have of whoever I should ask it to is what is the plan? Because we run a lean budget. All the departments that we have within 911 mapping and so forth, we don't really have a place to pick up $1 million. Right now, the state police, in my opinion, I've been doing this for 20 years, they alone cannot take on the answering all of the calls, over 200,000 calls that we have a year. This system, the way it's set up operationally, has worked very well. We've covered for them, they've covered for us, we're all a team. So there's just not $1 million within our budget right now that we can make up. So, and just to put a point on it, Barb, the locals volunteer to do this. St. Albans, they volunteer, they're paid, but there's 4 to augment with the 2 state police PSAPs. So we might be able to absorb 1 or 2 of them deciding to leave, but that's only going to make up what, $180,000? Is that right, a year, Barb?
That's right. So among those 4 regional PSAPs, it's about $360,000 of that 1 million or so for PSAP reimbursement. And if I could add just one more bit on the Agency of Public Safety discussion and it being part of the plan to resolve our budget deficit. Roger's recollection is correct. I remember that as well, about it's easier to find $1 million in a much larger budget than it is in our smaller one. And the other piece that I recall having a conversation with Commissioner Sherling about is that perhaps the dispatch fees that may eventually be collected by the Department of Public Safety for the folks that they dispatch for, perhaps those could be used to somehow support the 911 program and presumably a larger emergency communications program within that Agency of Public Safety. Those fees, though, are not being collected yet. So that's the only other piece of how an Agency of Public Safety might solve our problem that I am aware of. So, regardless of whether it's an executive order or legislative action, I don't have any detail on how that might solve the problem.
So, yeah, it is easier to find $1 million in 134 than in 4. But unless they've got spare cash in that 134 million, it's coming out of somewhere eventually. I don't know where the discussion is about the public safety, the whole issue. There were 2 of them there. I can check on that, but I think this committee should also be looking at that Universal Service Fund, perhaps just for this year. If the public safety thing isn't resolved, we could, if we're getting federal funds for broadband, perhaps we could take the Universal Service and move stuff around as a stopgap, because it's easier to pay off $1 million than 2 million, and if this drags out, then you're going to be in trouble. And I'm getting set to wrap this up. Committee, any other questions? Senator Brock?
Well, I'm just kind of synthesizing what I've heard here today, and it leads me again to a couple of questions. First, for the E911 board, who owns the E911 board at this point?
I'm the chair. I answer to the governor, and it's an independent board, if that answers your question, Senator.
Well,
Brock.
I know we talked last year before we adjourned that there needed to be some sort of an interim responsibility. And we talked about the agency of administration being the agency to which the board reported. And I know there was some serious discussions with the secretary at that point. Did that ever happen?
Yeah, I think that there was 3 different possible landing spots for us, as I recall.
Yeah.
And Department of Public Safety was the most logical. And that was reported back to Secretary Young.
All right. And nothing ever happened, though, beyond that, other than the proposal to create the agency?
That's my understanding.
So
yeah.
there was no activity. So at this point, you belong to the administration of the governor's office.
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of looking for recommendations for this committee, I would assume that the secretary of the agency of administration and the governor's office would be who we should be asking. How would you propose that we do this rather than our doing it out of the blue in an uncoordinated fashion?
Other committees that we've spoken to feel the same way, I think.
Yeah. I mean, do you have a recommendation for us?
In terms of making up
How we should solve this problem?
the financial problem, we raised the USF 0.4% for broadband. That essentially took that safety net away from being able to cover any shortfalls the 911 system has. We're the 4th on the totem pole of that money. So, and I'm quite surprised at that because we're such an essential part of the safety of the citizens of this state. So right now, my immediate solution is to dip into that broadband money and to make us whole. And then the only other thing I've offered in other committees, Senator, is to have a group of people from the various committees of jurisdiction, any administrations, to sit down and see what we want to do. I don't have any problem of being a good player here and helping out in a transition to the department or the agency of public safety. However, I want to know what the plan is, other than we'll find it somewheres. And then I want to know if that plan is sustainable. I also want to know that there won't be any mission creep where our funding is co-opted to support other programs within the department or the agency.
But one of the questions that we're still asking is whether or not the E911 board should belong to a agency or department of public safety, or whether or not it should be part of a revived Vermont Telecommunications Authority that takes all the telecommunications facilities and puts them under one coordinated roof. Do you have any opinion on that?
I don't know enough about the Vermont Telecommunications Authority. I know that Mr. Whitaker has suggested that to us, and the administration had already decided at that point to go the agency route. So in one route with the agency makes sense because operationally it's all of the law enforcement agencies that do all of the call taking. In the other sense, with the technical aspects of it, and what little I know, more technically minded, group, might make sense. But I really don't know that much about it, Senator, in terms of the Vermont Telecommunications Authority.
And I think, again, we're running into time because we still don't have a telecommunications authority bill, so we don't even have, and I have been reminded we have 3 weeks till crossover. So it's time's getting short but I want to make sure that we have a fallback to make sure you stay up and running while we work out all these other who's going to be in charge. So, and that we didn't part because seems to me it could go up to 2%. And we said, no, we set it at 2 and dedicated the difference to broadband. That was pre-pandemic, and that was the only money we had at that point for broadband. So we may be looking at that. I'm going to have to move us on. But I think this was a little more focused update than we had the last time. And I think we'll keep working on it. And it'll probably be something that gets put in another bill, but we'll get to it. Okay.
Appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've lost my agenda again.
Senator Cummings, this is Faith speaking.
Yeah.
We have timing issues with our agenda. Abby and Graham need to be in Ways and Means. Probably they should be there at 3:30. I would suggest.
It's 3:23.
Exactly.
Tell Ways and Means to forget it.
Well, but then they need an hour. And so that just bumps the rest of our agenda.
How long are they going to be in Ways and Means?
Till 4 o'clock. Abby and Graham, do you want to join this conversation?
Okay, so why it is, can you come back at 4? And we'll do our next week's agenda discussion.
And do you want me to bump AOT?
No, see if AOT might be able to come a little early.
Madam Chair, I'm dismissed.
Yes.
Thank you so much. All right, bye-bye.
You
See you
don't need
tomorrow.
me to dismiss you. Thank you.
Not at all.
Okay. Can we, so Abby, can you and Graham come back at 4 or?
I can come back at 4. I don't want to speak for Abby.
Yes, I'm available.
Okay, so as soon as you can get here, and we'll go on to our agenda for next week, and maybe we'll see if Maria or Rob White are available. Faith, can you just drop them a note?
Yes.
Okay. So we will continue. We're still trying to find the right slot to have the discussion about next week's agenda. And I got a note from the Pro Tem's office after the reminder to chairs that crossovers quickly approaching, and they wanted to know what bills I thought we might get out. I am still hoping, yes.
I apologize. I just found out that Abby and Graham have been freed from Ways and Means and are coming back. Can you?
They've been freed from Ways and Means, so they're coming back. Okay,
do you want to take them now?
Yeah.
Okay, pardon me, continue with and I'll try to line everybody up.
So anyway, I'll continue to tell you what I told the Pro Tem's office. They wanted to know what bills we thought we would get out. I told them I was still hopeful we might find some compromise to move forward on S1, but I wasn't sure. I wanted to get out S60, which was that flexible for the muni public power supply, some form of flexible rating, and they're coming in. And then the WEC taxation bill. Those are the only, I looked. We probably will get the tampon tax out too. Because I told you we'd do that. Other than that, we frequently don't have a lot of bills in committee early on, but this is a sparse year. We aren't doing a whole lot COVID related, but those are the three I'm going to try and focus on and get out. There will be others dropping our way. And Abby's back. Is Graham back? Not yet. Abby can push buttons faster than Graham. And there's Graham. Okay. So
Oh.
Graham and Abby, you're here. It says the Vermont tax link up, but this was the whole PPP deductibility and the potential deductibility or double deductibility. I learned today at lunch that the House either has or is about to pass out a bill on this issue. So, and what I was told is that they will keep the link up for tax year 20 because people are already pretty well into doing the tax preparations for 20, but that 21 is up in the air. They haven't made that decision. So Abby and Graham, you probably know more than I do. So this was just a money chairs, and it's a brief updating of what's going on in other committees.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know how we want to, Abby, you want to proceed here. I think Abby and I, we have documents that essentially roll through some of the impacts of the federal COVID legislation on Vermont. And that sort of ties into a discussion about, linking up to the federal code. So if you would like, Madam Chair, we can discuss the issue that you're talking about, or we can go.
I think just walk us through your presentation.
Okay.
Because the House has decided to do something does in no way mean that we are going to decide to do the same thing. Senator Bray.
As we go into this, that I have a clear recollection of what the challenge was, and that was that PPE money coming through was treated as, although it won't be treated as income, so it won't be taxed as income. And then on top of that, because wages are ordinarily a business deduction, they're allowing also the use of that grant to be treated as a deduction. So those are the two things, correct?
Yes, I think there's sort of two questions as it relates to PPP taxability. The first question is whether Vermont wants to pick up the federal treatment of so the federal government said that PPP loans that are forgiven are not taxable. So there's the first question, so whether Vermont wants to pick up that treatment. And the second is for expenses that are paid for by PPP loans, whether those are deductible. And that's the second question of whether Vermont wants to pick up that. And, amongst many other federal provisions that have impacts on Vermont taxes.
Can I just be clear? The feds do both of those. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
I'm working on the agenda. We're moving things around as I speak. Okay, Senator Sirotkin.
Just by way of, you said there are many federal changes. I know we've talked and asked questions about this one on several occasions. Is this the biggest one, or are there other big ones where the state revenues are taking a hit?
I would say this is the biggest one that would have a revenue impact on the state. There are, I would say, anywhere between 5 and 10 additional ones that have smaller revenue impacts, but this committee or the legislature can either link up fully to those provisions, or whether they whether they want to sort of decouple or require an add back.
Does your presentation list all of those, or
yes,
are they Okay.
Why don't we go through the presentation, then we'll probably have a better handle on what we're looking at. I think this may be a little broader than the PPP issues. I've just told Faith, I think we'll cancel the Agency of Transportation right-of-way discussion today. That way we have more time here and more time for our discussion for next week as we're putting the agenda together. And so Graham, Abby, the floor is yours.
Okay. I think the best way to do this is for me to essentially walk the committee through some of the Vermont impacts of COVID legislation at the federal level. And I think Abby's going to follow up with a discussion about linking up and the impacts of that, and then the options before the legislature, what they can do about some of these things. So I think I'll start, and then Abby can sort of talk about the link up and actions the legislature can take. So this is a document that I have posted on, that Faith has posted on the Senate Finance Committee's page, and it's entitled Federal COVID Stimulus Bills, Tax and Other Provisions. I'm going to sort of go through this because it is a long list, but I'll try to highlight some of the biggest ones here that will have impacts on Vermont, and then some others that might not have impacts on Vermont, but you might get constituent questions about it. So I wanted to also include that in this document. So I guess just beginning from the top, so there's two major federal stimulus bills. First was the CARES Act, and the second was is HR 133. It was passed in late December of 2020, and the CARES Act was passed, March or April, I think April. And so there were tax items in both of those bills, and programs that were created that required attention to what their taxability might be. And so I'll walk through those just based going through each bill. So beginning with the CARES Act, there are a number of smaller items with Vermont flow through. The first is the CARES Act allowed for individuals to make early withdrawals from their retirement accounts without penalty. So the background here for the committee is that in normal times, if you make early withdrawals from your retirement accounts, your IRAs, your 401ks, you are assessed a tax penalty on top of that. So you pay the taxes on the income you withdraw, but you are also assessed a penalty, which is usually about 10% for withdrawing early from your IRA. In the CARES Act, there was provision that said that if you you can make up to $100,000 from your retirement account without any sort of penalty. But to do that, you or your spouse must have been diagnosed with COVID or face some sort of financial hardship. Again, there's no necessary you have to prove that or not. I haven't seen any sort of forms that say you had to prove that you were impacted. But generally, the way that's going to work is if you withdraw money from your IRA, it's going to be counted as taxable income. But you can withdraw it over 3 years and you can pay it back without any consequences. And also, any minimum distribution retirement rules are waived for 2020. So for just background, you are penalized for withdrawing money from your retirement account early, but at a certain age, you are required to start distributing money from your retirement account as well. And those penalties and those RMD rules were suspended for tax year 20. And the impact on Vermont here is that individual retirement account withdrawals are considered part of one's gross income as part of AGI. And so to the extent that lots of people are doing this, it'll drive Vermont taxable income up via AGI. But also because Vermont picks up the federal penalty. So we have the federal penalty for making an early distribution, but then we have a Vermont penalty on top of that. So to the extent that that's waived federally, then Vermont is also waiving the penalty. That's a really small amount of money, that penalty that Vermont gets, but it is, a revenue impact. So that's the first area. Are there any questions on that one?
Senator Pearson.
Yeah, I'm struggling to keep up here, Graham, but if you take advantage of this opportunity, withdraw some money, you're not taxed or penalized because of if you can prove it's COVID related, basically, right?
You are taxed on the income that you take out, but you're not penalized for taking it out
Okay.
early. Yeah.
And then you go to and you pay back. So you're taxed on the income. So when you pay it back, is that forgoes tax just the way an initial contribution does? Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So it's a pretty good deal. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And this is only for tax year 20. So the opportunity to do this is gone. It's passed. The second item was this new above the line charitable deduction. So the CARES Act established a pre-AGI deduction not to exceed $300 or more for any charitable contributions made. So if we think about the tax form, the first step you do is you essentially tell the IRS what your income is by adding up your wages, your salaries, your pensions, your Social Security, all sources of income. And then there are some small deductions you take before we arrive at adjusted gross income. Some examples are the student loan interest deduction, the educator expenses deduction. So these are what are called above the line charitable deductions. And above the line always means pre-AGI. And this above the line charitable deduction for charitable giving means that it is happening pre-adjusted gross income. And because Vermont starts at adjusted gross income, allowing a pre-AGI deduction in effect makes Vermont pick up the deduction because we start at AGI. And so this above the line charitable deduction was in the CARES Act was only effective for tax year 2020. But spoiler alert in the presentation, in HR 133 was extended again. So, and it was doubled for married couples. So I don't think there's a very large revenue impact because it's only $300, and the value of that deduction is essentially $300 times whatever your Vermont taxable income is, or sorry, $300 times whatever your Vermont effective tax rate is. So it's not very much in Vermont revenue terms, but it is from a policy perspective because Vermont allows a charitable credit on our side. So you receive a 5% tax credit in Vermont for all your charitable giving, regardless of whether you itemized or not. And so if you're allowing a pre-AGI deduction, in effect, you are allowing sort of a double dip. You're giving a tax benefit for the deduction via pre-AGI, and then you're also giving a 5% tax credit on the $300 through the Vermont charitable tax credit. Any questions on that one before I move on? Okay, now we're sort of getting a little bit deeper into the bill, and these ones I think are smaller and more difficult to grasp. But in the CARES Act, there are some changes to the limitation of business income and business interest deductibility. So prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a business was able to deduct most of the interest expense for borrowing. So if you're a business and you paid interest on a loan, you're able to deduct most of that. That was limited by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to say that you can't deduct more than 30% of your taxable income that is business expense or business interest expense. So this stimulus bill relaxed that threshold a bit by making the limitation 50% of taxable income. So this is a very in the weeds, but it does have an effect on Vermont because whatever that deductibility is at the federal level, Vermont is picking up most of it. So in effect, what Vermont is allowing is that limitation of 50% for that tax year. And then some other smaller items that will affect Vermont is the bill allowed for the payments of employer-paid student loans to be deducted as income for the individual. So if you are an individual working for someone and that employer pays for your student loans as an employee perk, then that payment is considered taxable income federally and in Vermont, because Vermont picks up that same treatment. So for any payments before, the bill said any payments before January 2021, if you're an employer and you make up to $5,250 towards an employee's student loans, that will not be considered as taxable income for the employee. And so it's unclear to me where this deduction is going to be taken on the federal form, but I think it's likely to have a flow through via AGI. So I'm guessing it's going to be a pre-AGI deduction, or they'll just, say that that payment does not count as taxable income. So I think that'll flow through to Vermont. Vermont will pick up that treatment because I think the effect's going to happen before AGI. And because Vermont starts its personal income tax before AGI, the employees who do have this benefit from their employers will benefit from this in Vermont. There was a bill, I think.
Graham,
Yes.
just this is Ruth, but a question on that is this is a tax deduction for the individual only, not also for the business. Is that
No,
correct?
that's correct. So it's for the individual. So right now, if they were to make that $5,250 or something right now, before the CARES Act, if the employer was to make that $5,250 payment to the employee, it would count as income for the employee and they would pay tax on that. This states that that payment is no longer taxed. And as I'm saying, I don't quite know how it's going to work on the federal form, whether it's going to be reduced via a deduction or whether they're just going to say this doesn't count as income, period. But the impact is, to the extent that there are employees in Vermont who do have a benefit like this, they will no longer be paying Vermont income tax on $5,250 of that payment.
Why would that not be a deduction to the employer?
It could be. I don't know the full rules around that type of payment. If it's considered, like a form of compensation, it would be deductible, but I'm not sure how exactly that is treated. So I don't want to get out in front of my skis, but I can look that up and get back to the committee and see whether that's a deductible expense for the employer as well.
Graham, how about for the employee? If my employer granted me $5,250 for to cover a class I was taking, and now that would have been treated as income. Would I have been able to treat tuition payments I made as a deduction on my tax? Or I'm just wondering do we allow for deductions for tuition payments on the part of individuals?
It's a good question. I don't know how tuition payments are like if an employer pays for your class directly. This one was for student loan principal and interest. So I'll have to check to see whether the employee has to claim that tuition payment as taxable income or not.
No, Commissioner Bolio has joined us. Commissioner, do you have an answer to that one? Just off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, but I'm actually digging in now, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. We'll continue on.
Can I jump in actually for a
Abby,
moment, Madam
yes.
Chair? So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. This was an issue actually that had come up in Senator Sorokin's committee last year. When there are actual like educational assistance payments made for an employee, there is a separate tax treatment for that. When it's payments made against an employee's student loans, that is not considered deductible. So there have been different proposals. I believe it's Connecticut has enacted a credit for employers against those payments. So currently that's not deductible for employers. However, again, it's different when there's actual educational assistance occurring in the taxable year. And I could dig into that more because I'm just sort of pulling this out of my memory from last year.
let's continue. We know where we need to get more information.
So moving on, there's a possible item that might have an effect on Vermont, although I'm leaning that it's not very significant. But you may have read this in the news: is the changes to the limitations on business net operating losses. So this is quite complex, but generally a net operating loss is when businesses report a loss, they can spread it across tax years to smooth their tax liability to sort of reflect fluctuations in the business cycle. And so the way that works is they might have losses in a given year and they might carry those back a couple tax years to smooth out their tax liability. They might receive a credit from those previous tax years or carry them forward. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump administration's tax bill, scaled back the ability for businesses to use net operating losses. Specifically, they were not allowed to carry those losses back to previous tax years. So if you were carrying net operating losses, you could only use those going forward, but not back to previous tax years and receive a credit. What the stimulus bill did was it allowed businesses to carry those back for 5 years, back to 2015. And it doesn't put any limits on the amount of net operating losses as a share of taxable income. We think this is probably not that big of a deal in Vermont because it mostly happened on the corporate income tax side, and Vermont decoupled from net operating losses for the corporate income tax years ago. But there could be, to the extent that some personal income taxpayers through pass-through businesses use net operating losses, it might impact us a little bit. Either way, we think the revenue impact on this one is very small, if anything. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip through the other relevant items because they don't necessarily have an impact on Vermont revenues. And I want to give Abby plenty of time to talk through the link up language and the options the legislature has. So moving along to HR 133, this was the bill enacted in late December. And it had a number of, actually quite a lot of tax provisions in the bill. But a lot of them don't affect Vermont. A lot of extensions of tax credits at the federal level, but also some larger changes to the federal tax code that will affect Vermont. So walking through those. So the first item that was in HR 133 that will affect Vermont is changes to the earned income tax credit at the federal level. So just as background for the committee for this discussion, the earned income tax credit for Vermont is essentially a federal piggyback. We say whatever your federal earned income tax credit is, ours is 36% of that. So we pick up the same rules as the federal earned income tax credit in terms of eligibility, income thresholds, et cetera. And so what this bill did is it allows those who are applying for the federal earned income tax credit and the child tax credit to look back to their 2019 tax year incomes for the basis of those credits. And the idea here is that for many taxpayers, their 2020 wages might be too low to make them eligible for the credits when they file for their taxes in April 2021, looking at tax year 20. So they may have been laid off from a job and not actually made very many wages last year. And so those low wages might prevent them from being able to access the earned income tax credit. So what this bill did is it said you can look back to your 2019 wages for the purposes of the earned income tax credit. And this is only applicable for those people who are for people filing for their tax year 2020 taxes, so the April 2020 filing season. And this has a Vermont impact because Vermont has this piggyback on the federal earned income tax credit. So whatever the rules are around the federal earned income tax credit, Vermont's just going to pick up. And so absent any Vermont legislation, Vermont's earned income tax credit is essentially going to be allowing this 1 year look back of one's income for the purposes of the EITC. So absent any Vermont legislation, you might see more people claiming the EITC than you would if you decoupled, for instance, because more people would have the ability to look back at their 2019 income. Are there any questions on that one?
Any questions? I can't see you, so holler.
Yes, I have a question on that.
Senator Hardy.
Excuse me, I don't think I understand this. Earned income tax credit. Isn't that a tax credit for lower income people? And is that right, Graham?
That's correct.
Okay, so if they're looking back to 2019, the assumption is that people's incomes were lower in 2020. Why would they need to look back to 2019? And wouldn't that just make fewer people eligible for it?
It's a good question. The answer is there are minimum wages that you have to have in order to receive the EITC. So what this is solving is the idea that, like, if you don't work at all and you have no wages, you can't claim the EITC. That's sort of the earned income part of the earned income tax credit. It's sort of you have to work in order to get the tax credit. And so the idea here is that because lots of people got laid off for huge chunks of the year, their wages might be too low in tax year 20 to make them eligible for the EITC. So there are floors for the EITC and then there are ceilings. So if you make over a certain amount of income, you're not eligible. But what I think they're trying to solve here is that you have many people who are unemployed for large chunks of the year last year, but they were receiving unemployment insurance and doing, okay. But the earned income tax credit, they would be ineligible to claim it because they don't have that many wages from an employer. And so by allowing them to look back to tax year 19, it's sort of saying, well, absent the pandemic, here's what, my wages would have been. And so it keeps them eligible.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Great.
Senator.
I didn't. Okay, you weren't on my screen, Senator Pearson.
So that's why I hollered out. So Graham, piggybacking on that question, so what happens so they can look back a year, then they only worked, let's say in 2020, they actually only worked for 2.5 months and was unemployed. And then of course, for a lot of those people, they earned more money because of the federal bump. And so if we were looking at their actual income, although not from employment, it might have made them ineligible. So is that, which, I'm open to that. I think there's some logic to still helping them, but does that dynamic come into play, or basically there's going to be a forgotten year in terms of their income eligibility for the earned income tax credit?
I believe what you're saying is right. I can double check this, but to the extent there are income ceilings. So if you make a certain amount of income, you are ineligible for the EITC. And that might be another reason why the look back might be beneficial here, is that by looking back, some taxpayers may have made more income than they would have in a normal year because of the enhanced unemployment insurance benefits in the CARES Act and in this bill. And so those might have made someone ineligible, both because they might have had low wages, but because their overall incomes would be higher. And so you're right that I think that might also be a sort of reason why Congress put in this look back, is sort of to give them those taxpayers. So those taxpayers who normally do count on the EITC wouldn't be surprised in April when they were not they weren't eligible for it.
Senator Bray.
So a quick question on those payments. On unemployment insurance, you do pay taxes just as though it were your regular paycheck, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But on the federal bump on top of it, were they treated as regular wages in terms of tax payments, or did they just get appended and there was no liability on the $600 bump for Medicare, Medicaid, SSN, all that stuff?
No, those additional bumps were considered taxable as well. They weren't counted as wages though, so that's a key thing, and that's another that's kind of getting at the crux of this issue, that those payments from UI are not considered wages. So the wage income part of the earned income tax credit is very important. And so you might have a taxpayer who had more gross income this year than they did last year, but the wages part of it is very small, such that it's not enough to make them eligible for the earned income tax credit. Or their income is too high to make them eligible for the earned income tax credit.
And this is federally defined. So, I mean, it's one of those things that as we describe it, or as you describe it, sort of doesn't make sense if you're paying taxes on it. It seems an awful lot like income, even though it's not quote unquote a wage. So if we do nothing, it's not treated as a wage. Is for my considering calling those payments enhanced unemployment payments that came out last year, just redefining them for purposes of eligibility as a wage, or is that not a viable redefinition?
I don't know what the if the legislature wanted to sort of decouple from this. So if the legislature said that we think that these taxpayers who normally might receive the EITC but are not going to receive it for tax year 20 because they had enhanced unemployment benefits that were A, making their income thresholds too high for the EITC, and B, because their wages were too low in that year, then you could in theory just say that Vermont's not going to pick up that sort of line in the federal code. I mean, defer to Abby here on this one, but you could maybe decouple from that section of the bill, or you could, redefine what the Vermont earned income tax credit is. But I don't necessarily see a simple, straightforward way of saying, these people's for tax year 20, the enhanced UI shall be defined as wages. That seems a little bit weird to me. I don't know if Abby has any other comments on this.
No, I would need to look into that a little further.
It sounds like there could be winners or losers either way.
Well, you're not forced to look back if you don't want to. So if you were a taxpayer who, for whatever reason, your tax year 20 wages made your EITC more generous than it would be if you look back to 2019, then you can still use your tax year 20 wages. It's just an option for those taxpayers who do want to look back. They can use it.
Okay.
Do we
Any
know
other
what the impact is?
questions? Okay.
I don't know what the revenue impact is on this one because I don't have any information right now on Vermont's current EITC recipients and what their incomes will be for tax year 20. So I don't have an estimate on this one. I think my gut feeling on this is that it's not going to be particularly large, just because it's unclear to me how many people are going to be looking back to tax year 19. And the second part is the federal government, the Joint Committee on Taxation, when they scored this version of the bill, it was not a particularly large number. So that tells me that if it's not large at the federal level, then it's likely not going to be very large at the Vermont level.
Okay. Can we move on?
Okay, so the next item is this above the line charitable deduction is back. So instead of it just being $300, it's a $600 deduction for married couples and $300 for single filers. It's an above the line deduction. It was expired to end at the end of 2020, but it's now been extended to tax year 2021. So in effect, the Vermont legislature can decide if they don't want to pick this up, they have the opportunity to make this an add back or something for tax year 21 forms. And then the PPP program, this is the sort of big thing that we were talking about. So the bill itself did two major things. The first was it created a second round of PPP loans, and these loans now will be smaller and more limited to smaller businesses, so less than 300 employees, and they've needed to experience at least a 25% revenue drop in a quarter in 2020 as compared to 2019. And the maximum loan size for these is $2 million. So it's a smaller program designed for smaller businesses. But the second part of the PPP loans, it was the specification. We've talked about this, that the PPP expenses, if business used PPP money to make payroll expenses, that money can now be deducted from businesses' income. And so as we've talked about, this is sort of a double dip in the fact that the CARES Act said that any money that is for a forgiven loan for of a PPP loan, that is not considered taxable income. And then on top of that, any expenses that you pay with PPP money are also deductible against your income. So we still don't have our hands around exactly how large of an impact this is. The forecast did not build in a significant revenue impact on this one, but it did potentially, they built in a higher refunding number this year to make up for the fact that the language on this was not clear in the first half of the year. So it's a good chance that we have businesses in the first half of the year paying estimated payments, thinking that they were not going to be able to deduct expenses paid with PPP money. And so their tax liability was higher. But now that they know from HR 133 passed in December that they're going to be able to deduct these expenses, what that means is that they've likely overpaid in the first half of the year. And so we might see increased refunding. And so that was the two main channel that Tom Cavett and Jeff Carr built into the forecast. They weren't quite sure exactly what the impact would be on for Vermont revenues. So they left it sort of up in the air. My conversations with colleagues in other states have thought that this is a pretty large revenue number. Wisconsin actually put a number on it of about 260 million in Wisconsin dollars. And that would, they have a different tax rate and a different tax base, but that's sort of in the tens of millions of impact in Vermont, but we're not 100% sure whether that's the number for Vermont. We've asked Tom Cavett to look in this a little deeper and to look at our taxpayers to see whether our largest taxpayers in the corporate income tax and the personal income tax were those who also took PPP money as well. So we're not 100% sure what's going to be a large number, but I do think there's probably an impact here.
Question?
Got Senator Sorokin and then Senator Pearson.
On the original CARES Act, was PPP loans that were forgiven, were they considered income to the business?
No, they were not.
Okay,
They were considered not taxable income. Yeah.
Okay, but now because they're deductible, there's an added benefit. And the bump in the unemployment benefits that the feds give, was that considered taxable income?
Yes, it was considered taxable income for the individual.
Okay.
Graham, we've been having this conversation under the sort of umbrella of how much it might cost us, but I wonder in a related way, if we didn't link to the feds in terms of how we handle PPP, what, if you've thought of it that way, because we know roughly how much PPP came in, don't we, to the state?
Yes and no. So we know how much loans Vermont companies took out. It's 1.2 billion. What we don't know is how many of our what we call unitary taxpayers took. So a good example of this is American Airlines, right? Not a Vermont company, but they may have taken a PPP loan and they have a presence in Vermont. And so the data that we have from the SBA shows us strictly Vermont companies and what they took out in PPP loans. But there's this whole world of unitary returns of non-Vermont companies that do operate in Vermont that took PPP loans. And so again, it's sort of an up in the air question. We have looked at, if the legislature did decouple from this provision, how much would we could you expect? There's sort of two parts to that. The first is, tax year 20, and Abby will get to this. So there are the loans that were forgiven in tax year 20, which is already kind of passed for personal income taxpayers. And I think it would be difficult to decouple from this provision for that year because there's already forms and corporations and businesses are already filing their taxes this year. However, for loans that are going to be forgiven in tax year 21, you could also decouple from those. And I think that is, a little easier from an administration and practical perspective from the business. But then that raises questions about, you're not decoupling from one tax year, but you are from tax year 20, but you are for tax year 21. So it's like if you were a business and you managed to get your loan forgiven in tax year 20, you got the double benefit. But if you were a business who waited till tax year 21, you don't get the benefit. So it's kind of a difficult position, I think, for the legislature. And I'll let Abby walk through what those options are.
So you're saying 1.2 billion it's more than that, but 1.2 is direct to Vermont, and then there's these unitary companies. What about setting aside the dates and the years? Could we decouple in one instance? So to me, it would seem fair to say if you got a loan forgiven, that's income, but then the expense is just like a business expense. We kind of, if you buy computers, that's a business expense that's deductible, and so I'm wondering if we could split the baby in that sense legally.
I don't want to get into the legal part. I'll let Abby speak to that, but I think it's again, it's going back to this practical thing. Imagine if you're a business who got a PPP loan in July of last year. You used it to pay PPP expenses and it became forgiven in, let's say, November of 2020. And then you got this information from Congress that said this would be, all these expenses would be deductible. So in effect, what would happen is you were filing your taxes, in the first half of this year for April 2021, you would be filing them under the assumption that those expenses would be deductible. And so if Vermont decoupled from this, let's say you already made your tax payment, on your tax year 20 return, and then Vermont changes the law, would the tax department go out and say, hey, you need to refile again based upon this new change in Vermont law? That's what I'm saying is sort of the difficult thing with the tax year 20 link up. For the tax year 21, it's sort of a more advanced schedule, so you could, plausibly as a business comply with that a little easier, I think.
Can I say something to that?
I got Senator Rotkin and then Senator Bray.
I just want to correct something Senator Pearson said. It's not splitting the baby in the sense that your premise was that the loan being forgiven was taxable. The fact is that it's not taxable. So it's not taxable on the loan being forgiven, and it's not taxable and it's deductible when you spend the money in your business. So you get two benefits. And I'm just a little confused, Graham, by your position, because you got finished saying that Tom Cavett was concerned that we were going to have to give all these refunds back to businesses because businesses all during 2020 had been paying taxes or had not been claiming the deduction on business expense all the way through up until December 27. So you seem to be putting more priority on this last month than on the entire, the 3 or 4 estimated payments that business had been made, assuming it wasn't deductible. And on top of that, we haven't changed the law yet. So the law, someone's just jumping ahead and presuming we're going to give this added tax reduction to everybody.
I think you make a really good point that I think this is an inherent, I won't say issue with the way we link up federally to the tax code, in that it's sort of, we always link up almost in a retroactive way where, for instance, we are going, if the legislature passes the link up language this year, then it's, it's February 2021 and we are linking up to the code as of tax year, as of December, end of December 2020. So it's kind of retroactive looking. So, it is, I think you're raising an issue with the sort of way we do link up in Vermont is that for issues like this, I think from a practical perspective, from an administration perspective for both the business and the tax department, it's difficult to sort of, if a business has already filed its taxes, filed its year-end return under the assumption that, we're going to link up fully, and then we don't, then it sort of creates an issue. And I agree with the sort of premise there. It is difficult. If the legislature doesn't want to pick this up, then it almost has to act before the end of the tax year.
Okay.
That's pretty hard to do.
Okay, Senator Bray.
Same line of questioning that Senator Srotkin just brought up. Because didn't HR 133 only come out on something like December 25th or 6th or whatever? 7th? Okay. I'm trying to read Ms. Shipper's lips. I'm not succeeding. And it was very end of the year. So I would have thought that everyone would have been complying with the expectation that they wouldn't be deductions and therefore then paying tax at that rate. And I thought that the concern that Tom Cavett was raising was they would have in essence overpaid in anticipation of the prior law that what was existing. And that now we were going to be on the hook for refunds. So it seems like I can see how if you step up and all of a sudden someone had a larger liability and they only found out about it the last minute, that's putting them in an awkward position. But to not refund because they've been anticipating that the prior law would continue doesn't seem so awkward to me from the business's perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to Abby jump in here and talk a little bit.
Yeah, can I jump in just briefly there? There's a little bit more context to be given as to the interpretation of that being part of the prior law. It wasn't explicitly stated in the CARES Act, and the US Treasury did put out guidance, I think at the end of the spring and into the summer, making it clear under their guidance that deductibility was not allowed. So it was really only in this HR 133 that it was clear that the deductibility was allowed. That's clear.
The last thing, I don't want to drag this out, but have we, I'm guessing therefore that except for fourth quarter, we've probably received all payment, all estimated that it would have included that tax liability. And should we stick with the HR 133 thing, we'd have refunds to make or credits to apply. I don't know if we know how much that is.
I don't know. Tom Cavett told me they did not build in a specific refund number. But to the extent that you have businesses who had already filed their end year or individuals who had already filed their tax year 2020 returns, between January 1st and now, and they've received those refunds, if you decouple for tax year 20, I guess that's what I'm saying is the practical difficulty here is, do you go back to those taxpayers and say you need to refile again? Or I agree that for those taxpayers who haven't filed and who paid their estimated payments based on the assumption that these were not going to be deductible, what decoupling would do would essentially, it just wouldn't give them the refund that they might have been expecting. But for those who have already filed, I think it's a more difficult issue for them.
Have to file and amended. But
Madam Chair, I think I'm confused about something. Could I just ask a question?
Yeah.
That Graham, you've said repeatedly, this is tricky because people are already filing, they're already filling out forms. So you're asserting that this is tricky for us to do in terms of 2020. But the whole, correct, this is what I'm confused about. What we're discussing is linking up to the federal 2020 tax treatment, or how we do that, right? So the whole prospect that we're discussing is how and if we make changes to 2020. And it would be actually a real problem if we didn't link to the 2020 federal tax treatment, or am I wrong about that?
I'll let Abby pick that one up. I think that's more of a better question for her.
Sorry, just trying to.
Olio also would like to chime in here.
So yes, the typical way that the legislature does the link up is retroactively. So it's always the current filing season is what the link up is addressing. However, that does not prevent the legislature from making a determination going forward or for the current tax year. So what's under discussion here would be to decouple for 21. That's one option. But typically the annual link up, just because of the way that the statute is drafted and to allow the legislature to make that decision and review everything that has happened in the prior year, typically it is that backwards looking date.
Commissioner Bolio, can you shed some light on all of this?
I'd be very happy to, Madam Chair. I have appreciate you guys giving me the time to talk on this. I sort of invited myself to this party, but I do think it's
this was a briefing for us. So if you can enlighten us, it would be helpful.
Yeah, and really what I wanted to talk about today were the operational aspects of decoupling at this point. And my message to the committee is to urge extreme caution to decoupling from any provision for tax year 20 at this point. And Graham had touched on it briefly a few minutes ago that, I really think it speaks to some of the structural challenge of the way Vermont does the link up. Because, the ideal scenario here is that Congress passes forward-looking tax policy that allows states to be thoughtful about that in their legislative sessions and pass forward-looking changes if they disagree with certain aspects of the federal code. For a variety of reasons, that didn't happen here, right? But there's a long process that goes into preparing for tax season, right? So we start that process often as early as August to draft our forms, put changes onto those forms, onto the line items, onto the instructions. We work with software vendors like the TurboTax and H&R Blocks of the world to make sure that they're coding their software so that it can process our tax forms. In personal income tax alone for Vermont, there are 60 to 70 vendors just for personal income tax, just for our state, and all of them code their software to work with our forms. Now, some of those file, tens of thousands of returns from taxpayers, and some of them are a couple dozen. And we also program our internal system, right? VTax, to process all of these. So to change anything at this point for tax year 20 would require a rush job for us to change all of those things. We would have to change our forms. Let's take this issue, for instance, right? We would have to put an add back on our forms, change our instructions, get all the vendors to change their form, change the VTax system, and then for anybody who's already filed, have them file an amended return. I very much understand the difficult position that this puts the legislature in, because it really creates an issue if Congress is not passing forward-looking tax policy with enough time for states to respond, that it really disallows the opportunity to make an adjustment in the first year without significant hardship. But I have to say, there is no doubt in my mind that if we changed something that was significant enough that required us, if we decoupled from something that was significant enough to require us to change the forms, it would set my department up for failure. And we would have an extremely high risk of not getting the programming correct. We would have a nightmare on our hands trying to get amended returns. Folks on this committee may remember a few years ago when a certain software vendor messed up the IN 155, and our initial idea from the department was to have everybody file an amended return. And that quickly changed when we realized the chaos that would create. And this is sort of a problem with conformity in general, right? Because there's no great alternative. You could say, all right, let's just have static conformity, right? And we won't link up until the legislature's back in for the next year and they make a conscious decision about it. But we still have to do our forms in the summer and fall before, which means we at the department have to make a call. Do we expect that something is going to be conformed with or not? And so it would still create that first year problem if instead we just said, let's keep the forms as if we're not expecting conformity, but then that wouldn't allow the legislature to conform to things that they wanted to that next spring without creating the same operational problem. So I don't have a great solution for you, but I just did need to say that I am extremely concerned about trying to change anything for tax year 20 at this point and the impacts that would have on my department and taxpayers. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Pearson and then Senator Bray.
Thank you. Commissioner, when you did the programming and everything you've just told us about the challenges here, did you do that assuming we linked up to the 2020 code?
Yes, and that
you did that.
Again,
wait a minute. You did
Sure.
that in anticipation of us passing a bill.
Yes.
So what if we didn't pass that bill? What if I mean, I hear you that this timing issue is not under your control, but I mean, that's kind of amazing to me. You have presumed that we have taken an action that maybe we don't want to take.
Yeah, let me speak to that. So as far as I know, there has always been a link up. I do think there was one year, several years ago, where there wasn't a link up, but then it was passed in the subsequent year. We had similar conversations last year in the short session, right, where we were worried a link up wasn't going to happen. But it was, at that time, it was, well, do we change the form? But everybody said, no, we'll pass it next year, right? We'll get it done. The alternative is that we assume there's no conformity on things, right? And we would have the same problem if then the legislature said we are going to conform, right? Then we'd have to change all of our forms to do that conformity. And given that every year we pass a link up, the betting odds are on a link up. Again, I don't have a perfect solution for this because we either assume we don't have conformity, and then that puts the department and the legislature in a tough spot if they want to conform, or we assume conformity, and then it puts the legislature and the department in a tough spot if they don't want to conform. So given that we usually conform, always conform, that's what we operate with.
Commissioner, I know in the past there were discussions about why do we link it? Why don't we just have our own tax code? And it's always been, empire building, and it would cost the state millions of dollars because we'd have to hire people. We have a computer system, and it's not a discussion for today, but the one way to solve this is to say we're going to decouple completely, as I believe other states do, and set up our own income tax code. We could do that, correct?
You could, and I would ask to let us research that more. My off-the-cuff understanding.
I'm not going to call for a vote.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My off-the-cuff understanding, because my team has started to dig into this a little bit, is that it's a fairly even split between states that just do rolling conformity, which is that they always conform, and static conformity. But even among and Vermont falls into that static conformity because the legislature has to pass the link up every year. But even among those with static conformity, it's a very limited number that have any kind of long-standing lack of conformity. And I think it's Massachusetts and California that fall into that. Most states, and this is really in response to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that changed so many things, are linked up at least through 2018. So it's not, we'd be fairly unique if we just did away with it entirely, I think, but happy to research that more and come back on that topic.
Okay, Senator Bray.
Thanks, Commissioner, for explaining what goes on. I'm trying to reconcile what Ms. Shepherd was saying about federal guidance coming out throughout the year, saying that these awards, even if treated as grants rather than loans, wouldn't be taxable. But the deductibility wasn't, they weren't going to be, if you applied them to wages, they weren't going to be treated as deductible expenses. So I would have thought when you were developing forms and procedures and all that stuff from August on, that the expectation would have always been to treat these as, that you wouldn't have allowed for the deduction. And it's only at the last minute that the feds actually flipped it on you. So it seems like they're putting you into the situation that you're advising us not to put you in. So that's why I'm a little confused. Like, only at the end of the year did someone say, no, we're going to treat this as a valid business expense as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, Senator. So the reason that doesn't create the same problem for us when the feds changed it at the last minute is because if we conform, our form starts on the corporate side and business income tax side with federal taxable income. So if it's not going to be taxable income and the expenses are going to be deductible at the federal level, that means that if we link up, Vermont's definition of federal taxable income will match what they actually had on their federal tax return. And so we wouldn't need our own add back line on the Vermont form, which is what we would need if we, for instance, decoupled from this provision at this point. Does that make sense?
I follow up on that.
Yeah, I'm going to Senator Sorokin. Then I'm going to move us along because we're obviously going to come back to this. Senator Sorokin.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Senator Bray said. I was going to ask the exact same question. You spent a fair amount of time saying how hard it was for you to develop these forms, yet what you were developing in the fall, when you said you develop it, you were under a set of rules that said these were non-deductible expenses. Now you're saying that because you can link up, you don't have to put a line on the form, but one would have thought you put that line on developing the form because those are the rules you're operating in the time frame when you were developing the forms. It doesn't make any sense. And I also, from a practical standpoint, we're talking about all of this. I want to talk about from a theoretical perspective. You can get back to us on this, where the difference is, but it seems like there's an alternative solution here. The amount of PPP loans just in Vermont only has now risen to over $15 million with the second round. And we start talking about American Airlines and stuff like that. Let's assume it gets to $30 million. $30 million was the exact amount of money that Vermont taxpayers got hit with added taxes a couple of years ago. And we all rushed to give that back to them. Now, in this case, we're losing revenue and no one's saying that we should retain that money. Where's the consistency in those two things?
Yeah, appreciate that. Let me speak to both of those things, Senator. So I really want to clarify on that first point, and please let me know if I'm not explaining this well, because I do want to help explain this. The reason that our forms would not need that line as we originally start to develop them in the summer and the fall, is because at that time, federal taxable income did not include PPP loans, but would have not allowed those deductions. And our line one of our corporate income tax return, the CO 411, is federal taxable income. So as long as aligned with whatever federal taxable income is, whatever that may be, right? They could make a change yesterday at the federal level. If we conform with federal taxable income, whatever that may be, we don't have to change the Vermont form. The issue is if we have a different definition than what the federal taxable income is, we need to have that accounted for on the form. So it wouldn't have mattered. It didn't matter. Sorry, not it wouldn't have mattered. It didn't matter in the summer and fall that issue was sort of an unresolved issue, as long as we were going to conform to federal taxable income. So again, it puts us in that weird, like, do we assume conformity or do we assume not conformity? And the second piece, I think what you were referencing was the response in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, right? Where we had identified that there was like a $30 million tax hike, mostly on Vermont families. So, you know, I think the most basic reason that was different is that was policy that was passed at the end of 2017. Most impacts went into play for tax year 2018, and the legislature was able to come back in 2018 and work with the administration to have something forward-looking for the returns that would come in 2019. It's not to say that it wouldn't have been worth it to do the same thing, perhaps, but it would have been this exact nightmare that I'm discussing. So I think from a policy standpoint, the difference is also a $30 million tax hike may be more worth resolving than $30 million tax relief to a struggling business. But we didn't have to have that discussion at the time because there was time to make that adjustment. And you know, specifically with something that substantial, I'm just speculating at this point, but that was a huge overhaul to the Vermont system. To do that retroactively, I dare to say would have been impossible. Like to do that at this point in the year for filings that are coming in right now. So that's the difference there.
So we did it prospectively the last time around, and we got the money back to people that were added taxes caused by the link up with the feds. Is what is being discussed about possibly avoiding the administrative nightmare of 2020, but dealing with it in 2021. Is that similar, going the other way, but is it similar, but does it fully capture the lost revenue to the state, which could be substantial for 2020?
I'm not sure I'm fully following the question, but are you essentially asking if the
we heard that in the other chamber they were thinking about going in your direction on 2020, but left open the question of whether the link would continue somehow for the PPP loans in 2021, which I assume will be much smaller, but doing it for 2021. Is there a way, if we did that, to recapture this revenue from 2020, but to do it in a more administratively delayed way?
I'm sorry, I might be missing it, but there's no operational issue with decoupling for 21. Are you suggesting that we make an adjustment, that we recapture the tax year 20 difference on the tax year 21 returns?
I'm not making any specific suggestion. I'm asking, is there, it sounds like what we did in 2018 or whenever we had that $30 million windfall to, or increase in taxes to Vermont taxpayers, we found a way to give that money back where it wasn't administrative difficult. So could we find a way to keep Vermont whole without causing you administrative heartache?
Yeah, I think the legislature has an opportunity to discuss changes for tax year 21 that would be filed next year, if that's what you're asking. Yes.
I think what he's saying is, can we go back into 21? Can we go back into 20 and get the money back?
I mean, again, we'd be asking for amended returns or recapture. I mean, your big challenge that you have with that, my team has thought about that. Like, is that ever a way to dodge this timing problem? The biggest challenge that exists with that is you don't have a static number. You don't have the same taxpayers year to year, right? So you're going to have some portion that go out of business, that move, that never file again. How do you handle that equitably? I don't know. Again, I'm very sympathetic to the problem here, and I don't have a solution. A lot of states deal with this problem, and I think, yeah, it's just a messy one.
And I think the other question is, this is a unique year where money's gotten out the door and decisions are made on the spur of the moment. And I'd be a little leery of making major changes to deal with what we hope is a very unique situation, which is a pandemic. We've got about 7 minutes left, and we're going to be coming back to this. I want to ask Graham, have you finished your presentation?
Yes, more or less.
Okay.
And I think we've touched upon most of the
Okay, and
items here.
Abby, have you got something really quick? We will have you all back.
I've provided several very long documents for your reference that I wasn't planning on presenting today, just for you to know what's in the various bills in more detail. But I didn't have anything beyond what's been discussed today. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got Senator Pearson.
Well, I wonder if we could, to me, these are big questions, and notwithstanding the objections from the commissioner, I'm not ready to follow his urging yet. So I wonder if we could ask Graham to help us ballpark this. I mean, if we're talking about, a very minimal impact, then we should take the easy path. If we're not, which I suspect we're not, it'd be helpful to understand really what we were talking about. And I don't need it to be super precise, but it would really be helpful if we could be making these decisions with a little more knowledge.
Yeah, I can certainly look in that. That's something we're looking into for the other chamber as well. I just want to clarify for the committee that while there are separate rounds of PPP, what's important here is when the PPP loan was forgiven. And so for the sort of administrative and practical hurdles for this, it's for loans forgiven in tax year 20. There are lots of businesses who have taken PPP loans and that loan is yet to have been forgiven. And so it's not just the small program created in December that we're going to be talking about for tax year 21. There are also a significant number of loans that will likely be forgiven in tax year 21 that will face this sort of same question about taxability. So it's, I guess I would say that, it's not as if the entire, swath of PPP money, the 1.2 billion has sort of all been forgiven and we've sort of, the opportunity to potentially do anything on that is gone. There are still a large amount of money in that is going to be forgiven in tax year 21 that the legislature could do something on if it so wishes, not just the sort of the small program that was created at the end of the year. So I do think this is an ongoing question for the legislature, notwithstanding the fact that, there probably has been a bunch that has been forgiven already that, has the issues that we've been discussing.
Okay, Senator Bray.
To just follow up on that, what is there a test that's administered to a business to determine whether or not the grant is forgiven?
I don't know if it's a test, but they have to show, I think, their lender or the SBA that they've used the money for a PPP purpose, which is largely, I think it's 60% of it had to be used on payroll, and then the other 40 had to be used on things like rent and other operating expenses.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Anything else we should know? All right, we are not going to get to do more than 3 minutes. So on next week's agenda, we'll keep trying. Faith, did you send me? Did I see an email come in say that you had sent me? Oh, Faith is gone. All right.
I'm Faith.
Your Faith. Okay, no,
don't know.
Faith did send out an agenda for next week. I'm absent for a while on Tuesday afternoon, getting my flu shot, pandemic shot. But we're going to have a joint meeting on pupil waiting, and that's at with Senate Ed, because that's at the behest of the leadership. And okay, we still have S80, which is Senator Pearson's bill. We're going to do a walkthrough, and we don't have anything on Wednesday. Thursday, we've got a 2:00 joint assembly, but after that, we've got time. And then we have that analysis for financial viability. This is the public access TV study. We were told to had answers. We're gonna have, but what I'm planning on filling in there is Washington Electric Co-op and getting down to exactly what they want and moving that one towards being ready to vote, and the Public Power Authority. So if you've got any questions on any of those, get them into me, and anything else you'd like to plug in, let me know. Any questions you want answered. But for at least the next week or so, we're going to have to focus on the bills we've taken up and we want to get out. Senator Pearson.
Can you or Abby confirm that the House is planning to send us the so-called miscellaneous tax, some kind of tax bill? We always have the advantage of maybe adding things a little later. And so if we didn't have that opportunity, I'd sure like to understand that as we frame up our strategy.
Janet said no miscellaneous tax today, but it was at the very end of this money chair. So, but it's never called miscellaneous tax. So Abby, they do have a housekeeping bill, don't they, from tax?
I'm really not privy to those conversations, so I couldn't confirm that for you. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll check with Janet and see if it's it's not called miscellaneous tax. It usually starts out as the tax department's housekeeping or any tax bill. We also have Candy and a few other tax bills that we can turn into.
Is there
The nice thing about Senator Brock?
Is there a fee bill? Is there a fee bill this year?
You know that better than I do. My understanding is there is not.
I've not seen one. That's why I asked.
Yeah, no, not that I know of. And that apparently is part of the discussion around this bill back provision from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This seems to be going to more specific, but it's not as broad as a fee, which covers. So anyway, and I was also told that that's being looked at in the budget. So as we move forward, I'll try and tie that all down.
Your question about, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Senator Pearson.
We should I'm reminded by Senator Brock's question that the Cannabis Control Board is supposed, now it's a little bit backed up, but it's not entirely backed up, supposed to offer us a proposed fee structure. So if there's not, again, that's another question, if there's not something moving, we need to be clear with leadership that that could be a little late arrival and not get tripped up in crossover rules or whatever, because I think everybody agrees that probably needs some certainty before these businesses are going to start getting up and running.
Yeah. Okay. I'm making notes.
Okay. Um,
Senator Bray.
Yeah, so it just relates to the Fish and Wildlife bill back provision that could be related. So we were dealing with this in natural as part of Act 250 because they had an obligation to go out and do environmental impact assessments. It wasn't funded by anything in particular. Well, but there were 3 other ways of funding that. And for various reasons, none of them were being used. That included like no fee bill was being bought. There's already a build back provision, but it was termed to be cumbersome as opposed to modifying it to make it less cumbersome. There's a portion of every Act 250, a permit fee that goes to ANR. They have choices about how they divvy that up internally, and it apparently wasn't going to Fish and Wildlife. So there is a backstory behind it. I think that we ought to be covering the work, but I know it's just, this is not the only possible answer. And sometimes it comes across as this is the only way we can get there. And there's more to their choices being made before we ever get the request.
There is my 4:45 meeting, so I have to leave. Senator, would you take us off? Hello?